Alex Hormozi dropped a video called How to Learn So Fast, It's Almost Unfair. And I'm not going to lie, most of the video is genuinely very, very solid. He breaks down learning complex skills down into 7 steps. And in my experience, for a lot of skills, these 7 steps work. But I've taught thousands of students and professionals how to learn, and I think there's one step in here that requires a little bit more nuance. And it's the reason why most people stay stuck when they try learning complex skills in the first place. I'm going to go through all 7 steps. I'll tell you exactly what he gets right and where this framework starts to break
You have
down.
to understand what learning is. All right. So what is learning? So learning is same condition, new behavior. So that means you do something different in the same exact situation. So if I go knock, knock, and then open the door and you say, hi, this is Alex. And then I say, close the door. Next time, I want you to say, welcome to Starbucks. So then I go knock, knock. They open the door and they say, welcome to Starbucks.
The definition that Hormozi's taken here is what we would call a behaviorist definition, and it works. If I knock on the door and you change what you've said, you have learnt. But the thing is, learning theory has moved very, very beyond just this definition. For example, we actually have another school of thought, which is the cognitivist. So we talked about behaviorism first. There's also cognitivism, which says that learning can happen without visible behavior change. You can think about something differently without doing anything differently yet. And that is still learning. So for example, if someone knocks on the door and you still say, hey, hello, but you were meant to say, welcome to Starbucks. But if you have like an immediate regret of saying, oh man, I should have said welcome to Starbucks, technically that is still learning. This doesn't conflict with the definition that Hormozi has put here. He just said that if you do that, you're just less intelligent, which is not a bad definition at all, but it's only just one of those perspectives, cognitivism. So for physical skills, this definition, this perspective of behaviorism works, but for cognitive and meta skills like learning how to learn skills, emotional regulation, self-regulation, it is incomplete. Because it's important to note that developing these skills, these meta skills, goes beyond just our immediate observable behaviors. It goes beyond that behaviorist position. So keep this in mind because it does matter
Thing one,
later.
understand what learning is. Number two, deconstruct the skill. So what does this mean? So skills are typically chunked up or chunked down. So basketball, some people are like, he is good at basketball. They're saying he has many skills that relates to this thing. Now within basketball, you've got dribbling, you've got shooting, you've got passing, right? These are sub skills underneath of basketball. To the same degree in business, you can be good at business versus good at marketing, good at sales, good at product, good at hiring. All of these are sub skills underneath of those larger skills. Now, if we were to go even deeper than that, we also have generalizable skills across domains. So if I have great hand-eye...
The process is right, and everyone should be getting in the habit of breaking down skills into sub-skills. The challenge is that for meta skills like learning, most people don't really know what they're deconstructing. And that's where we need a bit more nuance. Deconstruction is quite intuitive for most people when it comes to sub-skills that are very, very visible. So for example, in basketball, dribbling, jump shots, passing it to people, etc., all of those are quite clear. In the context of sales, having energy, having charisma, all of those are quite clear. But when it comes to something like meta skills, like learning itself, deconstruction becomes very, very difficult because it's happening in the brain and therefore is invisible. Another thing that just makes this more difficult is people just don't know how learning works. Like a piece of evidence for this is what we call misinterpreted effort hypothesis in the literature, misinterpreted effort hypothesis. And what this says, it says that most people, most learners, they use that internal feeling of effort as a gauge for quality. So when they hit a wall, when it gets really hard to learn or the notes are really getting messy, the process is chaotic, they interpret that discomfort as a signal that they are bad at learning or the technique isn't working. But in reality, that is desirable difficulty at play, that struggle. And desirable difficulty and cognitive energy being invested is a prerequisite to develop expertise in any field. So that effort is actually really, really good. But because they lack that sub skill, or even just the understanding that this sub skill is required, mitigating cognitive discomfort, they just bail. They revert to easier, low utility methods like highlighting, rereading, and just taking linear notes just because it feels smoother and it feels easier. But again, if you want to master something like learning as a meta skill, one of the first sub skills that I teach any of the professionals or students that I work with is your ability to persist whilst in a state of high cognitive load and getting used to that. You have to learn how to thrive in that discomfort instead of retreating from it and just avoiding it entirely.
What good looks like in practice. What does this actually mean? Okay. So if I said I want to get good at foul shots, all right? So foul shots probably have different parts associated with it. There's probably going to be, I have to measure the distance, and I could probably say, what percentage of my shots did I hit within the box? Okay. What percentage of the shots did I get what percentage of them did I get in altogether? Right. And then within that, I could probably say, how many times did I finish my follow through? And like, I don't know anything about basketball, but I would be like, okay, am I finishing above my head? Because that's where I want the follow through to be. And where is my shoulder position? Am I twisted? Am I straight up? Am I squared with the basket? How many times did I do this? And so you might hear this and be like, wow, this sounds overly complex. It's like, well, welcome to winning, right? We have to break things down. And
I completely agree here. And again, if you have a target and you're not tracking, again, you're just not serious. Like that we're aligned on that. The nuance here is that people set win conditions. So win conditions meaning their definition of success way too far out, just way too far out. So for example, I do want to talk about it in the context of stress management, just because it's a bit easier to give this example. If a practitioner is working with someone that is a very bad chain smoker, the very common win condition that a lot of these chain smokers set is, I want to stop smoking. I want to go from a pack of cigarettes a day to like half a pack and then just 2 cigarettes, etc. The problem with these numerical goals is that they are often really out of reach for many people, but these numerical goals are outcomes at the end of the day, and they only come from small changes in your behavior to begin with. So there's a few problems that I see here. Number one, most of the people that I coach, they don't even get in the habit of defining success. Number two, when they do start getting into the habit of defining success, the way that they do it is too numerical and it's too outcome based. And number three, it's just too far. It's just too far detached from reality. So, you know, when behavioral psychologists are working with people who are trying to develop a meta skill, something like stress management, something like emotional self-regulation, one of the wins, especially when it comes to bad habits, is just developing an awareness around your triggers. So for example, if we were working with a chain smoker, if I was working with a chain smoker, for example, one of the win conditions that we talk about is just realizing when you want to smoke. So even if you come back next week and you're still smoking a pack of cigarettes, maybe you smoke more, who knows? But if you just have an inkling of the triggers that cause you to smoke, for example, maybe it's after like a really intense meeting, maybe it's when you walk past your building and there's like the smoke room, just developing an awareness of those triggers is what it means to win. Because that gives you an increased likelihood that you might get rid of the habit. It doesn't guarantee it, for sure, but it gives you more of a likelihood than instead of just setting this arbitrary goal of being like, oh, I'm going to cut it down to half, for example, right? Another win condition is delaying a bad habit when it comes to that behavioral psychology input. When it comes to just delaying, for example, smoking here, that is also a win, because again, this gives you an increased likelihood that you start becoming aware of, when I don't smoke, what do I tend to do? How do I tend to like get out of my stress? Am I using any adaptive stress management processes, or am I always using these maladaptive coping mechanisms by smoking, etc.? That is also a win, but many people do not see that as a win because they are just fixated on the fact that they're still smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. I give this example because it's a lot easier to talk about in the context of self-regulation and emotional regulation, stress management. In the context of learning, if we go back to what we talked about, we talked about the misinterpreted effort hypothesis, just delaying the amount of time in which you give yourself to give up. So for example, if you give up like 5 minutes after difficulty strikes, but this time you go into the habit of giving up just 10 minutes later, that is a huge win. Or if you just persist through it, that's a huge win. Or if you realize that you're feeling discomfort and then you use a learning technique to manage that discomfort. For example, we talk about offloading onto, a nonlinear format a lot more as one way to mitigate that difficulty. That in itself is a huge win. But again, a lot of people are just focused on the grades, the time it takes, etc. All these huge win conditions that are just so far from where they are right now. When they fail to achieve it, it just fuels their fixed mindset. So when it comes to defining success, the most important ones here is number one, you're doing it. Number two, you're being extremely granular and sensitive to what it means to win. And number three, you're not setting these outcome-based win criteria. You're setting these more process-based. You're being a lot more sensitive to the behaviors that are associated with developing a certain skill or just getting better at a certain skill.
That brings me to number 4, which is ignore the black box, okay? So ignore black box. Okay. So let me explain what I mean by this. A lot of times people will try and create this narrative around psychology, around emotionality, around biomolecular, whatever the hell, gobbledygook. And so I can say that it is incredibly difficult to understand why something works or why people do things. But what we can observe is whether something works or whether they did something. And so we want to say, okay, we have this box. There is an output.
For physical skills and for more observable skills in this situation, gripping a tennis racket, shooting free throws, smiling when you shake someone's hand, I 100% agree. You don't need to know the neuroscience. Like, you shouldn't be asking why, and you shouldn't be a philosopher for these things. And you just need to do the reps. Like, the inputs and the outputs are visible, and the feedback loop is very, very fast. And I agree. Like, the amount of times that I've had coaching consults where I'm like, dude, can you just use this tool? And they're like, why do I need to use this tool? Can you please give me the research papers behind it? And it's just like, dude, if they just used it, they would see the benefit. They spend more time asking questions around why and how to do things over just doing it. So this is what I call my practice information over experimentation, right? This is where people are just way too consumed on getting information, but they don't experiment at all. For complex cognitive skills, for learning how to learn skills, not knowing the black box is what prevents people from succeeding. So this is where there's a slight deviance and where you can't just ignore the black box. You need to actually know it, because knowing and understanding the black box a tiny bit is what prevents skills development. So for example, we talked about learning how to learn, the misinterpreted effort hypothesis. We talk about how good learning is actually uncomfortable. There's going to be that desirable difficulty in. And in that situation, we had to unlock the black box a little bit. We needed to educate people on what learning feels like and what learning is in reality. Because again, many people have many misconceptions. So the nuance is that we still need to, number one, even understand that there's a black box. Like, a lot of people just not comfortable with the fact that there is a black box. There is a black box. So number one, that's it. Number two, it does exist. As we talk about, that's number one, actually. It does exist. Number two, you need to know a little bit about it. But number three, if you know too much of the black box and you spend more time unlocking this black box and you don't focus on reps, which happens for many people, you just end up in this productive procrastination. It's just a classic recipe for productive procrastination, where I've had many people just spend hours watching videos on how to do it, watching demonstrations, thinking about, what would happen if I did this, trying to apply it theoretically if I... But then I ask them, I'm like, hey, how many attempts do you have? They'll be like, I don't really have much. And so in this situation, we're very, very aligned. It's just that for metacognitive skills, for meta skills, I should say, for learning how to learn skills, there needs to be that behavioral aspect and that behavioral training where we let people know that you shouldn't have a bias towards information and a bias to itch this psychological, like the psychological itch, as he mentions. You should have a bias towards action, because action is where it matters. The example that I do want to give here that is where it starts to get a bit gray is, again, for learning how to learn, it's just not visible. So it's very hard to take a look at someone and do it. So a very common example is you could actually get two people in the same room who have the same teacher, who have access to the same resources, and they might be taking the exact same notes, exact same, like exact same pen, whatever it is. But then at the end of that class, if you were to approach them, they would actually have completely, most of the time, completely different understandings of the topic, the retention of their notes, and their ability to process that information. We call this deep processing. This is one's ability to make sense of information. And this process of deep processing, this thing, is hugely influenced by childhood factors, childhood experiences, and genetic factors. So again, you get those two people, and you'll notice that one of them is just going to be able to explain the topic a bit better because they're just genetically wired to be able to think about concepts in a certain way. And they don't even know why they're good. They just know XYZ. So this goes to an example that we'll talk about, Michael Jordan being the best in basketball, but he's not going to be the great coach. This is 100% the same here. Like this person that has higher deep processing because maybe they got lucky with genetics. Maybe they had the correct childhood influences in place. They were able to think about the content deeper compared to someone who may not have that. But again, you can see they did the same visible behaviors. They took the same notes. They took the same amount of notes and they did the same amount of practice questions, whatever it is. But again, because learning happens in the brain and there's so many processes happening in the brain, we have to unlock the black box. If we don't, we just won't be able to understand why these differences happen in the first place. So again, the perspective that Alex is taking here is very, very valid because he's talking about more observable behavioral skills in the context of business, which are very, very visible: sales, marketing, creating hooks, copywriting, etc. I am taking this from that aspect of learning how to learn and meta skills. So there is going to be a slight nuance here.
And so I said it before, but if you don't track, you don't care. And so you have to find a way to measure your success, measure the outputs, or you will never improve. And so what I do in my learning process, for whether I'm learning from a guru, from a course, a webinar, a podcast, anything, right, is I look at the top 10%, the top 1% of people first. And then I try to observe, what do they do? Not what they say about what they do. What do they do that I can replicate? And I want to give you like the hack of all hacks here. Most people who are good at stuff don't know why they're good. Michael Jordan, not a very good coach. Player, the GOAT. Bar none, no question, right? And so how can we have this guy who's so good at basketball not be good at...
So again, he's right. Like most top performers don't even know why they're good. Like, I had a friend who was really, really good back in high school, and he would give the worst study advice. Like all of his study advice goes against literature, like flashcards, rote memorization, spent hours studying. And he didn't even do that himself, right? But again, he just doesn't know. He didn't know, and most people don't know the learning literature. He just didn't know why he was good. But again, when it comes to learning how to learn skills, even if you copy their observable behavior perfectly, it doesn't guarantee results. And, I talked about how there's differences in innate deep processing. Some people have higher levels of innate deep processing because they just got lucky, or because, again, they had childhood experiences, because maybe they had to think hard and they had to do more critical thinking as a child compared to what you had to do. Their notes might look basic and you might copy the exact notes that they do and you might not get anything. You might even ask them how you did their notes and you might follow that and you might still not get anything. And that's difficult because, again, the processing happens in the brain. So the solution here is to learn more about learning. It is to learn more about how your brain works. It is learning about meta learning and doing your self-regulation, etc. Because these skills aren't observable. And another thing is that even if you had access to 1%, they just don't know how to coach it. So observation is powerful, but for cognitive skills like learning, the most important behaviors are the ones that you can't see.
So step 6 is that we have to analyze the differences. Analyze and iterate, which is what this is. Look at the top 10% of people, take their initial, and then use that as batch 1. Then look at the top 10% of your stuff, look at the observational differences, and keep doing it like coats of paint.
Again, he's spot on here. We agree here. He gives you a pretty good order to do this in. For example, in terms of putting in the volume and reps first, and then analyzing them, and making sure that you compare your output to the top 1% and your output. You compare your output and the output of the top 1%, you spot the differences and you adjust. The only gap here is 2 things. Number 1, how would this work for mental skills, like learning how to learn? And then number 2, what are some reflective techniques you can actually use here? So Well, in the context of mental skills, we call this your ability to tap into your metacognition, thinking about your own thinking, and the ability to observe your own thinking the way that he's observing someone's free throw technique or how he observes a sales call. That's what it means to try unlocking the black box for something like learning. Without metacognition, in the context of reflecting on your learning skills, you can do many, many reps and never know what you're doing wrong. Because again, you have to think about your own thinking. So his analysis framework works when the skill is visible, but for invisible skills, metacognition is going to be what's required. And I recommend anyone watching this video to explore Kolb's reflective cycles. We've got Gibbs' reflective cycles, Driscoll's reflective cycles, all these reflective cycles that are grounded in self-regulation literature and research that have been proven to work very well for skills development.
Doing it like coats of paint. Then step 7 is repetition. So if innovation, if necessity is the mother of innovation, repetition is the father of skill, which is that you repeat these steps over and over and over again until people call you a natural.
Repetition is right. You just need to do reps. Like repetitions is what is needed. And what's important is that the repetition is coupled with strong self-regulation, strong reflective practice, and external calibration. So make sure you're putting in the reps, make sure you're applying your self-regulation framework of choice, you're being sensitive, you're trying to do that metacognitive exploration, and you're learning more about the learning skills themselves. You're learning more about what it means to learn, what effective learning looks like. You're watching videos on learning skills from reputable resources like my channel, Dr. Justin Song, other YouTubers that talk about the learning how to learn space that you can trust, right? And making sure that you keep up with that. The last piece here is going to be related to motivation, because repetitions is what people struggle with, right? Having the motivation or the willpower. And the reality is that this does come back into self-management, how you manage your environment, how you set up your schedule, how you set up things around your environment to let you do that target behavior and put in the reps. So this comes into learning more about mindset, motivation, making sure that you can stick to a goal, which is independent of this video. But if that's something that you'd be interested in, let me know in the comments. I might talk about that as well. Hormozi's framework is great. It ticks many boxes. And for many physical skills and many skills pertaining to business, sales, sports, that's a physical skill, writing, copywriting, writing hooks, doing YouTube videos, public speaking, these work very well. And in fact, I highly recommend watching that video if you've been struggling with learning, because it talks about many things from a behavioral perspective. The issue is only when you try taking this exact framework and you apply it to meta skills and more complex skills like learning itself, to self-regulation, to emotional regulation, where these things necessarily are quite gray, and a lot of these skills live within the black box, so we can't ignore the black box. And if we ignore the black box, we actually just can't develop the skill. So I would say this framework gets you 80% there with anything, and for most people 100%. Watch this video if you've been struggling with it. I think there's a lot of reframes on how you need to approach your tendencies and your behaviors when it comes to learning new skills. But for the remaining 20%, for those who are working on more complex skills, like learning how to learn, emotional self-regulation, etc., we do need to explore the black box, but also making sure that we don't fall into it and prevent ourselves from taking action. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please let me know in the comments. I'm replying to all the comments, so I hope this video doesn't go viral so I can connect with the very few people that have made it to the end. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.